A lot is going on in the world, and particularly in the world of politics. And of course, we'll be honoring and continue to honor the legacy of a former president and all along those lines. So I've brought in a special guest that'll be talking about that on here on World Politics. Before I get to that, let me just talk about a couple of things that are going on in the political landscape and all in that way. In Tibet, an earthquake has killed at least 126 people and leaves many others trapped. And some people are definitely talking about the Sudanese rebels, and the U.S. says Sudanese rebel forces has committed genocide and imposes sanctions on the group's leaders. And Donald Trump Jr. has arrived in Greenland with a message from his dad. We're going to treat you well. And of course, there's been all this conversation about whether he wants to take over Greenland, meaning the president-elect, or whether he wants to take over Canada and a number of other places, including the Panama region that he's been talking about as well. So definitely there's a lot of folks that have been talking about that. And of course, the fact that there were 70 countries that held elections in the year 2024. And definitely a lot of folks have been talking about that, and even how there are other elections that'll be coming up in 2025. And Canada's Trudeau has announced his resignation after nearly a decade as prime minister. So he's stepping down in that particular case and all along those lines. And the Austrian far right gets a mandate to try to lead a government for the first time since World War II. So that's something that we're seeing as well. And they're saying that a far right leader could soon take the helm in EU member country Austria. And definitely we'll see how this all plays out in what goes on in that part of the world as well. Of course, people are still paying attention. And earlier today, we had our show around Ukraine, Russia, and that whole invasion has been going on with Russia continuing its assault on Ukraine, and Ukraine having its counteroffensive, and all in that way. And of course, a lot of people are still talking about the Israel and Hamas conflict, and hurdles remain as Israel and Hamas once again apparently are inching towards a ceasefire deal. And we'll see how this is going to wind down, as they're definitely been involved in a 15-month war in Gaza. And this hopefully will be bringing home dozens of Israelis held hostage, I should say, in all in that space. So, like I said, a lot's going on in what's going on in the world, on the political landscape. And one person that was very much involved in the political landscape was the former president who turned 100 years old and passed away at that age, none other than Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was known for a lot of things, including some of his humanitarian efforts when he was involved with Habitat for Humanity, and was also involved even in some Middle East kind of negotiations. I remember even as a youngster, I believe I was in my teen years during his presidency, and all in that space, the conversation around Egypt and Israel and some of the agreements that were going on in that particular time. But my guest of honor, and I've got one of my regulars, and we'll see if others join us as well, has been talking about how we have to remember the legacy of Jimmy Carter, both the good and the bad, but also some of the things that went on in his life that folks may not even think about, including how he might have been one that actually brought on some of the far right causes that have been credited to his successor, Ronald Reagan, and not necessarily to him. So I'm definitely interested to learn more around his thoughts around a number of these things. So I'm going to bring in David Gibbs from the University of Arizona and see what he's got to say about a number of these things in that space. So David, is glad to have you here with us, and to us to talk about the legacy of Jimmy Carter. I know that Jimmy Carter's various funerals have been going on, because I think that they had his body in D.C., and I think that may now be in Georgia, as they'll lay him to rest next to his beloved wife, and all along those lines and everything. And in 2 days, it'll be a national day of mourning for Jimmy Carter. And I know that there have even been some half flags or half staff that have been flown throughout the country and all along those lines. So I was just wondering if you could share your insights and how long you've been involved even in studying the legacy of Jimmy Carter and all along those lines. Because like I said, I remember that when I was doing his presidency, which would have been in the late 70s and everything, there were a couple of things that were going on. My parents were actually starting a radio station around that time, and I would have been around in high school. So that would have been probably the 1980 elections, I believe, was the first elections that I actually voted in, and all in that space and everything like that. But I just wondered if you could share a little bit about the legacy of Jimmy Carter.
All right. Well, I'll note that basically what I'm going to say about Jimmy Carter in this program will be based upon more research I've done in the Carter Presidential Library and many other archives over a long period of time. It's the basis of a recent book I published. And, it's a very mixed legacy. I, I will say at the outset, I think many people have a positive image of him based upon his post presidency, which really has been extraordinary. Probably the most impressive post presidency of any ex president in American history, in my view. And, most people aren't old enough to remember the Carter presidency as I am. And so what they remember is his post presidency, his efforts to eradicate disease, especially guinea worm in West Africa, which was extraordinarily successful. His modesty, the very fact that he did not make any effort to profit financially from his former presidential term, as most post presidents have. He's turned his back on what you might say is the soft corruption of post presidential American politics that numerous ex presidents, Democratic and Republican, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, they've all cashed in on their presidential affiliation. Carter did not. He just lived on his federal pension and had one house in Plains, Georgia, and that was it. And so I think people remember that. They remember him, building houses, standing on a roof with a hammer, teaching Sunday school. All of these things are true. They're very genuine. His presidency was really very different. And I would say he was a deeply conservative figure who inaugurated the rightward shift with regard to economic and foreign policy. Many of the things we attribute to Ronald Reagan really began with Carter. You might say, in a certain sense, Reagan gets too much credit because most of the things we attribute to Reagan preceded him and began with Carter, I would say. And that is what I found in the archives. I was really very struck by how conservative Carter's legacy was, and how, in a certain sense of the term, Reaganite Carter's presidency really was.
Yeah,
Um,
just really quickly along those same lines, because I brought in Rick Rosner, who's one of our other panelists, and I'm sure he's got some questions as well. But one thing that I was fascinated by in your research was how much he deregulated U.S. industry and finance, and I know that that's something that even our current president-elect has been talking about, and all along those lines, and he even lowered taxes on businesses and reduced the power of organized labor. And out here in North Carolina, I know that Rick's over there in California, but organized labor has always had a very rich history here in this area of North Carolina and everything like that. Sometimes it was seen as a positive. A friend of mine actually was one of the organizers against the Shoney restaurant, and I know some others that have been in that whole Fight for 15 and a number of other organized labor efforts. But it seemed like Carter's efforts actually hindered some of labor's movements and all along those lines. So I just wondered if you could share some of his business decisions and how they impacted his presidency.
the best way I could summarize Carter's presidency is that he shattered the New Deal. He had the New Deal of the 30s into the 40s, but you had what I would call the extended New Deal, the sort of labor-friendly policies, the policies that narrowed the gap between rich and poor to a significant degree up through the 70s. It was Carter that really shattered that order, that economic order, and Reagan continued the shattering. Um, as a general point, Carter was a very anti-labor president. He'd grown up from birth and into his early political career had been in Georgia, which was a right-to-work state with no powerful union movement, very different from the North. The South, generally speaking, has been weak with regard to organized labor traditionally, and that was where Carter was steeped in that environment. And so he didn't really see that much value for organized labor. He was, people forget this, not only a farmer, but really a small businessman. And so he had a businessman's conception. He had an engineering background from his days in Annapolis in the Navy. And he had an engineer's conception of technocracy and really didn't have that much room for a mass union movement in his conception of things. And a lot of his appointments were, I have to say, I was very struck by how vitriolically anti-union they were. Mm-hmm. His top advisor on deregulation was Cornell economist Alfred Kahn, whose views, he wasn't really an associate of Milton Friedman, but his views were really very compatible with those of Milton Friedman, I would say. And he, in an interview after he left the administration in 1981, he said, and I'm quoting him almost directly, I don't have the quote directly in front of me, but he said something very close to this. He said, I would love to see the Teamsters to be worse off. I would love to see the auto workers to be worse off. He didn't say that about big business or bankers. He said that about workers. And his policies reflected that. He helped orchestrate the deregulation of multiple sectors, beginning with airlines and then extending into trucking, rail, and especially finance. And this had a major impact in lowering wages. The deregulation of finance particularly helped fuel financialization, the movement of a whole conception of American capitalism away from industry and towards finance, which became much more profitable and much more attractive, and that helped fuel deindustrialization and the really destruction of high-paying union blue-collar jobs. And that was under Carter. And he also Carter appointed Paul Volcker to the Federal Reserve System, orchestrated a devastating series of recessions, collectively from 1980 to 82. It extended into the Reagan presidency. The recessions were the worst downturn since the Great Depression, and again, helped destroy vast segments of industrial America that really never came back, and the high-paying jobs associated with them never came back. And if you look at the record of Volcker, he also was a very deeply anti-labor figure, and this very much reflected Carter's agenda. And there are other things he did as well. He, in the 1978 tax reform, he lowered taxes, corporate taxes, the capital gains tax in particular, while he raised Social Security deductions, again, making taxes significantly more regressive overall.
Yeah, just really quickly along those same lines and everything in that space, I did bring in one of our other panelists, Sasha Starr, who has a show on Ukraine, Russia, and China, as well as one on chess and modern investment and all along those lines, and had been involved in the Soviet Army when he was in the Soviet Union, and it was also a native of Ukraine, so he definitely has some thoughts around that. And I know one of the things that you have mentioned about Carter is that he augmented military spending for the first time in a decade and diverted resources from a lot of domestic programs while increasing the U.S. interventions overseas. And I kind of mentioned how it seems like we're going back toward an interventionist kind of policy if we listen to what some of President-elect Trump is saying that he wants to do with countries, whether that's Panama or Greenland or a number of other places, including saying that he could possibly end the war in some of the conflict zones like Israel and like Ukraine in a matter of days and everything. But I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to Carter's foreign policy legacy as well.
Yes, he also had a very conservative imprint on foreign policy. The level of military spending had declined significantly. Ironically, the decline began under Nixon. It reflected American failure in Vietnam, and that the public simply would not stand for high levels of spending for a military that was losing a war and ultimately did lose a war. There's also a reduced level of military intervention, at least with regular forces, beginning with Nixon. That was the Nixon doctrine, although Nixon relied very heavily on secret wars by the CIA, proxy wars, that kind of thing. Regular wars with regular U.S. forces were disdained to a significant degree and not really practiced to a large extent during the 70s. And that reflected failure in Vietnam. I'll wrap this up very quickly because I know other people have things to say.
Right.
The most important thing Carter did was in the last 2 years of his presidency, he reversed these policies and began sustained substantial increases in military spending at a time that he was cutting social spending. So he was spending less on butter and more on guns and diverting money from butter to guns, which increased the level of austerity for the population and further concentrated wealth. He did indeed increase military intervention overseas. We've now learned that his national security advisor later boasted, not once but multiple times, that the 1979 invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union was something the United States deliberately provoked. And Brzezinski boasted about this multiple times. I can give, that's a long story, and so I can hold off on that for a moment. But I do want to note the Reaganite idea of relying much more on military force and military spending. It did not begin with Reagan. It began with Carter.
Hey, just really quickly, and I did see that Rick had a question as well, but one of the things we've been talking about on this network quite a bit on some of our economic shows is this notion of how much control the 1% have. Even Sasha Starr has talked about how the technocrats seem to be in control of a lot of things, even in this new administration. But I was wondering, because it seems that you seem to think that this notion, and I'll be in full transparency, let you know that I was involved in the early days here in North Carolina with the Occupy movement. So I do know about that notion of the 1% and everything like that. So just wondering your thoughts about Carter's role in this wealth disparity that we have with the 1% being in control of so much.
Do you want to have me respond? Because I know that.
Yes, I want to have you respond, and then I think Rick's got a question for you.
Okay, fine. Well, Carter, there are two considerations. One is that indeed the 1970s was a period of massive mobilization by the wealthy classes. The reason for this is the 1970s was a period when the rate of profit was the lowest it had been in almost a century. And inflation, we now know, studies have shown, believe it or not, inflation affected all social groups and the economy generally was hurting everybody, but affected the wealthy more than the poor, believe it or not. That's what the data show. And so the rich felt, and so you had the distribution of wealth was becoming more equal in the 70s, and the wealthy responded with a massive lobbying campaign, and one of the most massive in American history throughout the 70s, with the formation of new think tanks, lobby groups, educational institutions, aimed at completely reversing the situation and redistributing wealth upwards in their favor. And so this was also a major influence on Carter. I should add that this lobbying effort was to some extent pushing on an open door in the sense that Carter, I think, was predisposed to some of these policies already. But he clearly was also influenced by this massive lobbying campaign that was taking place. And I should add the lobbying campaign was taking place not only with regard to economic policy, but also foreign policy. There was a big lobby in favor of increased military spending and increased interventionism taking place simultaneously. And so I think it was two things, Carter's predispositions, as well as this external lobbying effort that had begun from the beginning of the decade and became very intense by the time of the Carter presidency.
Yeah, Rick?
Yeah, David, you can correct me where I get things wrong, but I was a teenager during Carter and remember Carter being a victim of the press's increasing focus on foolishness. So in the early 60s, JFK is banging everybody, even as a sex room in the basement of the White House. You don't hear anything about that. And then things start getting weird with the hippies, and LBJ picks his beagle up by the ears, and you start seeing like goofiness. Then Nixon pretty much has a nervous breakdown while in office before resigning. And then Ford comes in at the same time SNL, Saturday Night Live, comes on, and nobody'd seen satire before on network TV, and they portray Ford, who's, a pretty, an athlete, a former college football player. They portray him as a stumble bum, just tripping over everything. And then we get Carter after Ford, and he has ridiculous stuff happen to him that gives the impression that he's a weakling. He gives a Playboy interview. Playboy used to be the most prestigious magazine to give an interview to, weirdly, because they did in-depth interviews. And during his campaign, he said he was guilty of lusting in his heart after other women. And much of the nation laughed at him for being a wussy, for admitting that he looks at other women. Then when he's president, and he's on the downside of his presidency, he runs in a 5K race. He gets hemorrhoids. He has to take a day off from the presidency to get his hemorrhoids treated, which is an embarrassing disease. And then the goofiest thing is he's out in a boat fishing, and a swamp rabbit swims up to the boat and bites him on the hand. And America just thought, this added to the idea that this guy isn't, Reagan strong. He's on a horse. He's 6 feet 4 inches tall. He's, so.
I think there's no doubt the press after I think the key feature here was the Vietnam War. And the Vietnam War had so discredited all public institutions, the press became, at first it became more lively in a serious way. They had investigative reporting that uncovered things like the My Lai massacre, published the Pentagon Papers, published revelations about the Central Intelligence Agency, scandals, serious scandals. But obviously there was also, as part of this irreverence that came out of Vietnam, a lot of silly stuff happened as well. And Carter was not very effective in dealing with it. Clearly, Reagan was much better at dealing with it. I think a couple of points on that is that Reagan's big advantage is that he was a proud conservative who undertook conservative economics, sort of free market economics, and was proud of it and boasted about it. He boasted about raising the military spending, intervention, and so on. Carter never boasted about it, and he seemed to be pained while he was doing it. Everything he did it pained him. It pained him to implement austerity. It pained him to undertake policies that got people fired from their jobs and so on. Whereas Reagan was proud of everything he did. He made almost no apologies at all. And clearly the no apology style works a lot better. It's also one of the reasons, by the way, we associate Reagan with conservatism, because Carter never openly said, I'm a conservative and I'm proud of it, whereas Reagan did, even though their policies weren't that different. And so I think Reagan was more effective in style. However, above all, the most important thing was economics. It's always the economy, stupid. Carter's, it was Clinton who coined, well, I should say James Carville in 1992 coined that term. And it's a basic point. Political scientists all know this. It's always the economy, stupid. That's usually the number one issue in elections. Carter ran during a recession that is virtually guaranteed to cause you to lose an election. Reagan was able to engineer the economy such that the recession was over by the time he ran for re-election in 1984, so he was more successful. It's not true, by the way, that Reagan was exceptionally popular. I looked at his average polling numbers. If you look at Reagan's average polling numbers over 8 years and then compare them to the average for 13 presidents from Truman all the way to Trump, Reagan's dead average. He's just average. He was not, people like to think he was the most popular president since FDR. That's not at all what the numbers show. Carter was below average, and it reflected the fact that Carter ran for re-election. The economy generally was performing poorly throughout his presidency, and he ran for re-election in the middle of a recession. That's always a bad idea.
That sounds like a bad idea and everything. Just really quickly along those same lines, Dr. Gibbs and everything like that. A couple of things that you said that I was curious about, and one comes to what Rick said, and then I want to get to one that's part kind of tied to North Carolina and Atlanta and all along those lines. But one of the things I was curious about is, as I remember, and I was a teenager also when the Carter presidency was going on, it seems that was one of the first times that we really saw a public view, and I'm not even sure how much he's involved in the funeral arrangements and everything, but we saw kind of the raising of a child within the White House. A lot of people talk about the Obama kids, but I do remember Amy Carter literally being a kid when Carter's presidency was going on and all along those lines. So whatever became politically of Amy Carter, is she involved in politics? Did she follow in her dad's footsteps at all? And is she involved at all in the political landscape? Because I know that some people, even in the Cheneys and others, and the Bushes have had their siblings go into the political realm, but I don't know if she did or what happened within her own life and everything.
Amy Carter was a preteen, I believe, during the Carter presidency. She, was herself something of a public figure, and she was a child. She had a treehouse, and she did childish things, and normal childish things, and she. It was significant that Carter, to show he's a regular person, put her in a public school, very close to the White House, but it was a public school, not a private school. I think he was the last president to ever do that, to his credit, I would say. I think it presented Carter as a family man. He was a family man. His wife was always by his side, and his daughter was by his side, and so on. It presented a positive image, I think, although it didn't compensate for the much larger negative in terms of the bad economy, and that it didn't change that fact. But mostly it was positive. She, in the 1980s, she became involved in anti-interventionist movements. She was involved in demonstrations at Brown University. She associated with Abbie Hoffman. I believe she briefly might have even been arrested for some of her demonstrating activities. I'm not sure about that. But she pretty much dropped out of public life after that. And she became a private person. I don't believe she's done any significant number of press interviews since her time as a demonstrator against intervention in the 80s during the Reagan period. And she's decided to have just a quiet life, to the best of my knowledge. I believe there's a grandson, Jack, who ran for the Senate from Nevada, but did not win, maybe 10 years ago. I don't remember the exact date. So he really hasn't founded a dynasty of any consequence that I'm aware of.
Yeah. Sounds like that and everything.
We
Just
should
really
bring
quickly.
Sasha, you come from Russia, where you've been bombarded with propaganda as a young man, because Russia's built on propaganda. The U.S. CNN comes on the air for the first time 5 months before the 1980 election. So should we talk? And the think tanks you talked about in the late 70s, they laid the groundwork for a lot of the current stuff that's going on now. Because my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong, is that one thing the think tanks found out, what the Republican think tanks, is that you can push low information, that is dumb voters, around more easily. You can get them worked up, and that the Republican Party has been focusing on low information voters for the past 50 years.
Do you want me to respond, or maybe Sasha should respond since he hasn't said anything as yet?
My response is very simple. First of all, by 1976, I was already in Canada. So I was no longer subject of Russian or Soviet propaganda at the time. I'm from Ukraine. Ukraine was a part of Soviet Union at the time, and it was almost the same as all the other republics. There was no substantial difference in terms of being subject to all the government propaganda and so on. And indeed, around 70, 72, I was in the Soviet army. And of course, it was well before Carter would be president. But you see, the situation presently much more dangerous than that at the time. I'm talking about 70s and even 80s, but specifically 70s, because the perception was that there are two so-called powers. One was the Western powers, NATO, particularly, and the Warsaw Pact countries, which were, as it became obvious, but much later, they were much weaker, and they were really no match to NATO and even United States alone. But it was revealed much later. So that situation guaranteed a status quo, so that every power has its own sphere of influence, and they never meddle into each other's affairs because of the threat of mutual assured destruction. Today's situation is very different, that for various reasons that I'm not going into, but Putin decided that the old world order, which was established in Potsdam in 1945, is no longer viable for Russia. It needs to create a new world order where Russia will be assured of its place in the world, the re-establishment of a Soviet Union, or as much as it's possible at all, and therefore they would go in sort of in their own way. And if somebody doesn't like it, prove it, bring your weapons and fight. What Putin calculated, and rightly so, is that the most scary thing for a Western Europe, United States, is a war, is a threat of war, and not even thermonuclear war, because thermonuclear war is very simple. It will be momentarily affect that probably both sides will disappear from the place of wars, or maybe one side will win, but that victory is probably even worse than that if you lose. So therefore, nobody thinks about the thermonuclear war, because if it's happened, it happens, and everybody's dead, And if not happening, then it's even better. But the conventional war, that's what the West and the United States are scared of. And Putin played very skillfully on that fact. What the atrocities, what he is doing now in Ukraine, it's a signal to the West or United States or both that this is what's going to happen. You may win that war, but look at destruction, what I've done to Ukraine, and the same destruction I will do on you as well. So therefore the West is paralyzed, and in fact, by having enormous advantage technologically, financially, military, all kinds, they cannot do anything against Putin. And I'm wondering, very soon we'll find out how Trump is going to play this card.
So you said each has their own sphere of influence, but David said that Carter goaded the Soviet Union into going into Afghanistan, which was a disaster for them.
And what?
The evidence for this is beginning. Well, let me say that a little bit of detail here for those who weren't around then, as I was. There was a civil war in Afghanistan between essentially unpopular Soviet-backed communist government, but an Afghan communist government in Afghanistan, and a series of Muslim groups who really were not very nice either, honestly, collectively called the Mujahideen.
Yes.
The Soviet Union invaded in December 24th, 1979, remained there for almost 10 years, 9 years really. And it was a disaster for them. There's no doubt about that. At the time, it was widely believed this was an unprovoked invasion, and that the United States, they'd accused the United States of interfering in Afghanistan and doing all sorts of negative things. And nobody, including myself, believed them. It turns out there was some truth to this, and we know this from the very best sources. It turns out, the documents have become declassified in the 90s, that the Central Intelligence Agency, at the urging of Zbigniew Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor, and at the approval of President Carter, authorized direct U.S. aid to the Mujahideen guerrillas, fairly small-scale aid, but aid nonetheless, 6 months before the invasion. This aid was done in secret. It was secret from the U.S. public, although it wasn't secret from the Soviets, I'm sure.
Of course.
Soviets found out about this, and we now know they became very paranoid. They suspected, I think incorrectly, but nevertheless, they believed the U.S. was going to try and establish bases on their borders and so on. They're very, very paranoid about events on their borders.
I'd like to comment on that.
If you don't mind, let me just finish because it's an important story. The key issue here is it was done with the intention of provoking an invasion. We have that from Brzezinski, who said that repeatedly. After the Cold War was over, of course, but he said it first of all, he said it immediately after the invasion. He was briefed by his military advisor, Lieutenant General William Odom. Odom briefed him on the invasion, and Odom said to a British historian later on who published it, that when he briefed Brzezinski, his first reaction was to pump his fist in the air like this in triumph and said, "They have taken our bait," meaning that the aid to the Mujahideen was baiting them into invading. Later on, he gave a long interview with a French magazine called Le Nouvel Observateur. It was originally in French. I've translated it into English and published it. And Brzezinski went on at greater length, basically stating, in essence, that he provoked the invasion because he wanted to give them their own Vietnam, which he did. And also, I have to say that there was a certain amount of lying to the public because the claim was made there was no provocation. It was unprovoked, and Soviet claims were false. But there was some truth to what they were saying. Again, that didn't justify the invasion, which was illegal. Everybody agreed it was. There's no doubt it was illegal, but that didn't change that fact. But there was a certain ruthless streak in Carter's presidency. One more point, by the way, it was frequently claimed Afghanistan was strategically vital, and that's why the Soviets invaded it. It really wasn't true. If you look at declassified documents from the 50s to the 60s, all along, American officials again and again said Afghanistan is of no strategic importance. It's nowhere near the Persian Gulf. It has no infrastructure because it's so rugged. It's one of the poorest countries on the planet. It's of no importance to the West, but the Soviets are concerned about it because it's on their borders. That's what the document said. we now also have the Soviet documents. I've seen the Soviet documents, which became available in the 1990s when the Soviet archives were opened. What they show is the Soviets did not want to invade. They recognized the danger, but they set aside the reservations for a number of reasons, but including the fact that the U.S. was intervening in Afghanistan.
I think Rick had another question for you.
So should Carter get some credit for bringing down the Soviet Union? Because Reagan gets all the credit for bringing it down with Star Wars.
There's all sorts of reasons the Soviet Union collapsed. I think the principal one is if you look at their life expectancy at birth, I believe it became, at least for males, it started to become flattening out in the 70s, which indicated very serious problems after 1970. And their rate of productivity probably declined as well. So they're having very serious problems in their economic structure beginning in 1970. Honestly, I don't know why that was so, but they're clearly having problems long before Star Wars, long before Afghanistan. But probably those things didn't help. Whether they were sufficient to push them over the edge, I don't know. But there are all sorts of reasons the Soviet Union collapsed, and attributing it to any one factor, I think, is probably too simplistic.
Well, weirdly, one quick thing. There's a Tom Hanks, Julia Roberts movie about this whole thing that I'm sure gets everything wrong.
It's a terrible movie. I would recommend it. It's not history. It's fiction. Okay. I know it's based actually on a book called Charlie Wilson's War, which sort of glorifies the CIA program. Fact is, the people we were backing in Afghanistan, both sides were awful. The communist government was awful, but the Mujahideen were at least as bad.
Go ahead.
Osama bin Laden indeed was working with the Central Intelligence Agency during this period. What became Al-Qaeda was groups the CIA were training and arming during this period. So there's a lot of historical amnesia about what really happened in Afghanistan in the 1980s.
David, I agree with all your points, but I would like to expand on it.
Please.
The reason that Russia invaded Afghanistan is that they still had that old doctrine, which was invented by Vladimir Lenin, that expansion of the socialist, or you want to call it communist, revolution throughout the world. And of course, the Afghanistan was very close, and it was at the border with the Soviet Union. So when there was, let's call it unrest, or at least some challenging situation, Russia saw an opening to create a socialistic republic in Afghanistan. And actually, not all Soviet leadership was for the invasion. They were debating it, and it happened in the very last moment that one party took over the decision, and they decided to invade. However, let's go a little bit ahead into history. First of all, the reason that there was a failure to establish socialist republic in Afghanistan. Same thing as when American did invasion of Afghanistan in the 2000s, and they spent just as much efforts from a financial point of view, military-wise, and so on, and they couldn't succeed. Although the idea was perhaps to establish some kind of a new free Afghanistan, a new Western type of civilization or so on, it all failed, same as socialist ideas, same as the free world ideas, because some countries, I'll tell you a lot of countries, but some countries, which Afghanistan, of course, is included, there are tribal people. They cannot be neither socialist nor free world. They have to be what they are. That's for next 1,755 years. That's what they're gonna be. Don't try to change them. It just makes things worse. You have to let them just live their life as they understand it, as they run it, and leave them alone in this rugged, horrible area of the world, one of the most horrible areas of all Earth. Just leave them there. Don't touch them. So Americans, while they provoked, as they say, Soviet Union to invade, it's not the only reason why they invaded. However, let's agree with that. So how come America didn't learn anything from that?
all I can say is that there's a tremendous amount of hubris among major powers. I think anybody who studied the British experience in Afghanistan would have concluded that you stay out of Afghanistan. Yet the Soviets went in, although I think they went in much more reluctantly. Is my impression. I'll go into that in a moment. But the Americans, I have to say, when the Americans went into Afghanistan, I said to myself, I've been studying Afghanistan since the 1980s. That's kind of how I began my career. And I said, this is not good. The Americans are going to regret this. They imagine that they can do what the British couldn't do, what the Soviets couldn't do, and the Americans imagine we can do it. And sure enough, that was arguably the longest war, certainly one of the longest wars in American history. And here we are with the Taliban back in power. Trillions of dollars spent, thousands of American lives, maybe I think 150,000 Afghan deaths were lost for nothing.
Actually, no, history is only one man who conquered Afghanistan was Alexander the Great.
Oh, yes, a
He
couple
was
of
only one.
right.
Yeah,
It's been
Alexander
a long
the Great was
time.
the only one there and everything. Hey, just really quickly, Dr. Gibbs, one of the things I was curious about, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, and it comes down to Carter's legacy and everything, is, like I said, I'm here in North Carolina, and one of the things that certain North Carolina's governors get credit for, Jim Hunt comes to mind, and others, is this notion of a new South and everything like that, and a new Southern leadership. And when I think of that, I actually think of Carter, because Carter, like you said, had some conservative values, but he was also known as being somewhat of a liberal on social justice issues, particularly around race and everything like that. So there's this notion of there being a new South kind of leadership. I think even to some degree, Trump kind of played on that in his campaigning in the South and everything like that. But I just wanted your take on this notion of there being a different kind of South than the old South that existed in the, not just the Confederate days, but even the 60s and the 70s. And there'd been like this new South that came out in, I would say, the 70s and the 80s, and maybe even this new era that is now going on, where people are touting Georgia and North Carolina and others as being leaders in the new South as compared to, say, Mississippi or Texas and things like that. But I just wanted your take on this notion of the new South.
That is an important point. I mean, that clearly was another one of Carter's legacies that was clearly very positive, is that, he was, as everyone knows, he broke a certain stereotype and a certain mold. And that was the idea of that to be a white Southerner meant you were a segregationist.
Right.
And that was the image people had based on people like Lester Maddox, former governor of Georgia, George Wallace, and Theodore Bilbo of Mississippi. I mean, this long litany of, frankly, sort of hideous racists that had dominated Southern politics for so many decades. And Carter was different. He wasn't perfect, by the way, and even on racial issues, but he on the whole, he was pretty good. And I think the Black community of Georgia was so impressed with him that they openly promoted his candidacy for president. I mean, initially, I think when he ran for president, I suspect many people in the North, many Black people in the North, were suspicious of him. He was a white Southerner, and he can say he's different from the rest, but he had a Southern accent. He had spent his whole life in the South. For generations, his family had been there. I assume they were intimately connected with the Confederacy, like nearly all white families were. So he was distrusted, but the African American community of Georgia insisted he was a man who could be trusted by Black people. And it was the Black vote that enabled him to win the Democratic primary and then win the presidency. And that was really quite striking. And so he did essentially shatter the idea that to be a white Southern politician meant you were automatically a segregationist. That he did bring about a basic change in the image of the South, based on his governorship and then his presidency. Famously, his inaugural speech in Georgia was that the time for racial discrimination has come to an end. Famous words, and he did mostly hold by that, and that is to his credit. Yes.
So I know a conservative who gets really worked up if you bring up Carter, calling him the worst president in American history. Now, but you've said that Carter was pushing a lot of conservative stuff economically. Should the Fox News crowd give Carter more credit?
To some extent, they have. His deregulation guru, Khan, who was a major figure in his administration, even though I don't think he's remembered anymore as a household name, he's been celebrated by the right, by right-wing think tanks like the Mercatus Institute. I believe the American Enterprise Institute have celebrated his legacy as the founder, the originator of deregulation, and he was Carter's appointment. Another figure was Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker was sufficiently liked by the Reaganites that Reagan reappointed him to the Fed. That was Carter's original appointment. So in some respects, basically, conservatives have already celebrated Carter, though I think they understate the extent to which Carter indeed was a deeply conservative figure, and they really should be, in some ways, more respectful of him than they really are, because he did the heavy lifting. Again, I personally don't like a lot of the things he did, because that's not my ideology. So I'm not praising him in this respect, but I am noting that if you are of a conservative ideology, there's an awful lot about Carter to like.
Hey, just really quickly, I brought in the founder of the network of Pod TV, Nick Valveda, who's actually now living in Barcelona, Spain. And one of the things that he brings up on some of our shows is the notion of the importance of the African continent. And I know that others on the network have brought it up as well. But I think that Carter was one of the original ones that kind of exploited this notion. And I know there are other countries, including Russia and China, that have been exploring the resources that Africa offers in its various countries. But I was just wondering if you could speak to his importance in doing some gains in both our Russian theater, I mean, not our Russian, but our African theater, and also our Central American and Latin American theater, because I do think Carter had a lot to do with all of those regions and everything like that. But I just wondered if you could speak to that, Mr. Gibbs.
Well, I think you have to, there's a bifurcation here. In economic policy, there's a continuity. In foreign policy, his first 2 years were different from his last 2 years. In the first 2 years of the Carter presidency, he wasn't so militaristic, and he even said in a famous speech at University of Notre Dame that America's gotten beyond its obsession with communism. That's what he said, or with Soviet communism. I think that was the words he used. He was later to regret that phrase, and he became very anti-Soviet later on. But his first 2 years, I think, were focused upon improving the American image in the Southern Hemisphere, including Africa. He appointed a former Georgia congressman who was an early political ally of his, Andrew Young, to be U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, a black man who had a lot of influence in the administration in the first 2 years. And he was very prominent in improving the U.S. image in the Southern Hemisphere, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, particularly in Africa, but also throughout the Southern Hemisphere, which had been so severely damaged by America's behavior in Vietnam, which had been perceived as a dirty war in the Southern Hemisphere, and done a great deal to damage, to stain the American image, the American brand. And Young dedicated much of his career to repairing that damage and giving a more positive image of the United States, moving the United States sharply away from what was then the apartheid regime of South Africa and its ally, Southern Rhodesia, which was also a kind of a white minority state, and sort of the, you had a series of white governed states, including Namibia and Southern Africa. And, American presidents, beginning with Nixon, had tilted American policy in favor of the white regimes as kind of realpolitik. Kissinger and Nixon, of course, were famously immoral in their foreign policy, and very openly so. Carter did tilt American policy somewhat, and particularly Young did, away from the sort of white racist regimes in the southern part of Africa, beginning with South Africa. Now, the last 2 years were dominated by Brzezinski, and in fact, Young was forced out of the administration. And Brzezinski was a Cold Warrior, and he saw Africa and the whole Southern Hemisphere as an arena for the Cold War, and favored much greater intervention, particularly in the Horn of Africa, and wanted to step up the level of military intervention generally. And so a much more Cold War style dominated in the last 2 years, particularly in the last year after the invasion of Afghanistan. The invasion of Afghanistan, that was the real turning point. That's where Carter fully went in favor of a full return to the Cold War and an ending of any cooperation with the Soviet Union. And it was dominated by high military spending, rebuilding the Central Intelligence Agency as a agency that fought secret wars, and intervening around the world, particularly in Afghanistan.
So you're suggesting the 1980 election was between two war hawk conservatives.
That's right.
So, and the pop interpretation of the late 70s is that America was tired just of politics after Vietnam and after Watergate, and the disco era came in, and it was the horniest era in American life ever, and we just wanted to go to the disco and do cocaine and hook up. So is that true? Were we just like tired, and while the new wave of conservatism came in and stole our shoes?
I think the dominant aspect here is the American public above all was very angry about the sort of stagnant and then declining living standards. People forget the post-1945 period had been one of rapidly rising living standards for pretty much everybody. And the working classes, the poor, Black people including, we're seeing rapidly rising living standards, admittedly, especially among Blacks from a very low base, but African Americans saw significant gains. The racial wage gap became increasingly narrowed. That started to erode in the 70s. The 70s was a crisis period where the economy functioned poorly, really throughout the decade, beginning in 1973, and particularly towards the end of the decade during Carter's presidency. And so I think that's what people were angry about. It is not true, based on public opinion polling. There's an image that the public became more conservative in economics. For the most part, that's not true. Free market economics had little appeal, according to public opinion polls. In fact, I've looked at the papers of conservative activists, people like Paul Weyrich of the Heritage Foundation. And what they said is that, we tried advertising things like deregulation and, reducing taxes on business, and the public hates that, he said. We gave up on that. And he said, that's why we went to things like evangelical Christianity. The idea was the public was socially conservative. A large part of the public, America's a very religious country, and there was an upheaval in terms of a rise of evangelical Christianity and a revolt against the liberalizations of the 60s, against, sex and drugs and rock and roll, if you want. And that was popular, the revolt against that. And so I think people like Paul Weyrich were extremely smart, linked up economic conservatism with cultural conservatism. And for the public, they emphasized the cultural side because they knew that was what was popular, whereas more quietly, they emphasized the business side, and business poured money into both. And you had a lot of businessmen who were secular. Some of them were, I suspect, were atheistic and weren't that interested in evangelical Christianity, but they funded it. So a very clever political strategy that aimed at shifting America to the right on economics, which was what they really were worried about. Abortion rights and all that sort of thing. The public was concerned about that, and there was the public was divided on things like abortion rights, and so they focused on things like abortion rights and things like immorality and things like that. Whereas I think businessmen were concerned about their bottom line, but they funded both because they realized that by fusing them together, they could get what they really wanted, which is a redistribution of wealth.
David, since we're talking about Africa, my question to you is, what is your thoughts about BRICS and the addition of Egypt and Ethiopia to the BRICS coalition?
I'm reluctant to talk about that. I do have a lot of thoughts on that, actually. And actually, for what it's worth, I began in the 80s. I began working in Afghanistan and also Africa. I've worked on the Southern Hemisphere a lot. And I think what you're seeing is the erosion of American hegemony. This was inevitably going to happen. And I think it's been accelerated by the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East. And the BRICS are the expression of a loss of confidence in U.S. hegemony. And it was inevitably going to happen just because China, even now, China is having an economic crisis, but even now, the growth rates in China are higher than in the United States and Europe. And so it's inevitable. China is going to become a much more powerful country and is going to overtake the United States. With economic supremacy comes increasing political clout.
Hey, just really quickly, we only got a few more minutes to go, and I do want to hear your conclusion to your thoughts on that, David, and everything. But I was just wondering, in that same line, are there things that you think that the president-elect, and like I said, he's definitely a conservative president-elect, has learned from the conservatism of Carter? Or because I know there's been some that even, I think he's even get some compliments in Carter's death and everything. So I just wondered, is there any things that you think that they have in common with each other or even the current president as well?
Stylistically, they're profoundly different. Carter was a very cautious figure. He was a very reasonable figure. He was a very strange combination of kind of a Baptist preacher and a kind of like I don't know, kind of a engineering technocrat. Whereas Trump is, this wild man who says all sorts of strange things. We're going to annex Greenland. We're going to take over the Panama Canal. So I don't see any comparison at all. And I would be reluctant to make predictions as to what he's going to do because he's a wild card. He's always been a wild card. And he's famously trumpets himself as a wild card in the sense that he doesn't really have a consistent ideology or policy. He makes deals. And so who knows what deals are in store. I think he does have some degree of skepticism about military intervention overseas. And it is true, there were fewer military interventions. There were no new wars under the first Trump term, which is interesting. Whereas obviously were new wars during the Biden term. We came pretty close into the first Trump term to having, for example, a war with Iran, but he didn't do it at the last moment. He decided not to. So I think there is some reluctance to use military force on the part of Trump. He is skeptical of that, whether for better or worse is a matter of opinion. But I think he has some reluctance to do that. On the other hand, he's hired a lot of people, such as Marco Rubio, who are very militaristic, and would seem, based on his record in the Senate, are very committed to the idea of using military force overseas. And so who knows what's in store for us in foreign policy. Now, with domestic policy, it's somewhat more predictable. I would predict a lot of his policies, for all the populism, will be traditional Republican policies: tax cuts for business, tax cuts for the rich. That's what he did in his first term. I assume that's what he'll do in his second term. There'll be lots of deregulation. I think that's virtually guaranteed. So I think domestic policy is much more predictable. Foreign policy, I would hate to make predictions because I suspect if I did, they'd all be wrong.
That makes a lot of sense and everything. Just really quickly, because like I said, we only got a few more minutes to go and everything, but you did mention that you got a book out and we do have an Amazon bookstore and everything. So if you will share the title of your book and just some of your amazing closing remarks and everything, and I'm sure that I will put it on our bookstore here on Pod TV and make sure that hopefully you'll get some sales out of your appearance here. And of course, I can't speak for others, but I think that Sasha, Rick, and one of our co-founders, Nick, Kim is the other co-founder, would love to have you make a return trip whenever you're available and all along those lines.
I'd be delighted to make a return. My book is called Revolt of the Rich: How the Politics of the 1970s Widened America's Class Divide. And it's about the crisis of the 1970s. The 70s was a crisis decade. How the rich mobilized during that decade to ensure that the crisis was resolved in their favor. And ultimately, the rich got everything they wanted. And they got everything they wanted by the end of the Carter presidency, and even before Reagan was inaugurated. And I think one of my central conclusions, indeed, is that Reagan gets too much credit for the conservative revolution, which in reality began with his predecessor, Jimmy Carter.
Really? Okay. Well, yeah, we definitely want to have you on again. And also, I like your statement when it comes to BRICS. And let me ask you this about David Halberstam, as you all know, wrote a book called The Best and the Brightest, which was during the Kennedy administration. They're going to bring Camelot. They brought the best and the brightest. Do you think Trump is going to do that, or does he have a history of not hiring the best and the brightest like Halberstam and the Kennedy administration? What's your thoughts?
One of the problems, you see, the best and the brightest referred to the foreign policy establishment as it existed in the early 60s. And there's still very much a foreign policy establishment, and a very distinctive thing about the establishment, the foreign policy establishment, in all of its forms, is it seems to have a loathing for Donald Trump and everything he stands for. I think mostly based on the fact that he's had a lot of rhetoric about distrusting NATO, and he's even said things about maybe leaving NATO, although he hasn't remotely done that in his first term. The very fact that he's even raised that as a possibility has led to a lot of open loathing by the foreign policy establishment. And so he's hiring at least some outsiders, people like Tulsi Gabbard, for example, who are very much outsiders, not really of the establishment. I mean, she has a top secret clearance. She's a lieutenant colonel in the Army, but I think on the whole, she's very much distrusted by the establishment, yet she clearly, Trump does want her in his administration. And so I would see that the kind of picture Halberstam painted of the early 60s, of the best and the brightest, the men, and they were all men in those days, who got us involved in the Vietnam War, despite their very high IQs and fine educations. They had a disastrous war. That referenced an era when both parties were very much part of the foreign policy establishment and deeply intertwined with it. And that seems to not be the case in the Trumpian period, where you have a party now, and certainly a president, who's deeply distrusted by that group.
Mhm.
He is distrusted by all groups, including the foreign countries. He is despised all over the world. And right now, it's all come into play. Tulsi Gabbard on public Russian television is called our Tulsi. So this type of people that he's attracting to the top positions in his government. All I'm scared about that his actions will completely derail U.S. economy, U.S. way of life, and it will go up in smoke, and he will not even will finish his 4-year term.
I'm not a Trumper, and I didn't vote for him, so I mean I can understand much of your reservation about him. I would say a lot of people thought that during his first term, and well, we didn't go up in smoke. I mean, it wasn't great. He didn't make America great in any respect. It wasn't particularly positive in any respect that I can see. But predictions people made, he'd leave before the end of his term, he'd be impeached, he'd be removed from office, and so on. It didn't happen, so I think we have to be a little bit careful there.
We'll wait. We'll just wait.
Well, wait.
He will finish the Iranian war in one day, as he promised. We'll start from that. We'll see.
For the media standpoint, he's great, because the thing is, you don't know what's going to happen next. So always bring new material to the table. And with that, unfortunately, we're at the end of the hour, but we'd certainly like to have you back, David. Thank you for coming. Sorry, and I was a little late, but I had another meeting. And well, hopefully, I'm going to try to steal you, get you on with David Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, who we run a show every week on, to discuss more about this. But in the meantime, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time on World Politics.
Thank you
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.